There's a quiet moment that happens when someone you once mattered to suddenly feels your absence. Not anger, not drama, just a subtle disturbance they can't quite name. Stay with me, because near the end of this conversation, I'll explain why that moment is far more powerful than chasing ever could be. And if this kind of psychological clarity speaks to you, take a second to like the video and subscribe. Not for me, but for the version of you that's choosing growth over confusion. Welcome, I'm Anastasia and you're watching PrismaLogic. Many men misunderstand what no contact actually does. They treat it like a strategy, a countdown clock, or a way to provoke a reaction. But female psychology doesn't respond to silence the way male logic expects. When a man disappears without emotional chaos, without explanation, without resentment, something deeper happens. At first there's relief, and this part matters. When emotional tension ends, the nervous system relaxes. The pressure lifts, the mind finally gets quiet. But that relief doesn't last. Because once the emotional noise fades, something else emerges. Contrast. Your absence creates contrast. When you were present, she didn't have to reflect. Presence fills space. Absence creates awareness. And awareness is where memory, meaning, and emotional reevaluation live. This is not about punishment, it's about psychology. Here's what most men were never taught. Emotional bonds aren't sustained by constant availability. They're sustained by emotional impact, and impact is felt most clearly when it's gone. When you step back without bitterness, without trying to teach a lesson, the mind starts filling in the blanks on its own. She remembers how she felt around you, not the arguments, not the last conversation, the emotional baseline, calm, safety, stimulation, or in some cases, regret. This is where curiosity begins, not longing yet, curiosity. Why did he stop reaching out? Why does it feel different this time? Why isn't he reacting the way others did? And that's when the internal shift happens. Because women are deeply attuned to emotional patterns. When a man breaks a pattern calmly, it signals something powerful, self-respect, emotional stability, inner direction, not dominance, not control, groundedness, and grounded men create emotional gravity. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Chasing communicates fear of loss. Silence, when rooted in self-regulation, communicates trust in one's own value. And value is not argued, it's felt. But this only works when the silence is real. If you're checking your phone every 5 minutes, replaying conversations, or secretly hoping for a reaction, you're still emotionally attached in a way that leaks through energy, behavior, and future interaction. Psychological distance isn't about time, it's about internal shift. When you use no contact as a space to reconnect with your life, your purpose, your body, your emotional center, you change. And people feel change even before they understand it. Women don't come back because they miss attention. They come back because they sense a man who no longer needs validation to feel whole. And that realization that you moved forward without collapsing is often what reopens the emotional door they thought was closed. Not because you pulled them back, but because you stopped holding the door open. What most men never realize is that no contact doesn't work on her emotions first. It works on her identity. When you step away calmly without pleading or hostility, you disrupt a psychological assumption she didn't even know she was carrying. The assumption that you would always be there, that you would always explain, that you would always try to fix, rescue, or reopen the conversation. And when that assumption collapses, something deeper than missing you begins to surface. She starts questioning her position in your life, not in an arrogant way, in a human way. Because when emotional access is removed, the mind instinctively asks what changed, and that question doesn't stay on the surface. It moves inward. Was I taken for granted? Did I misjudge his strength? Did I assume his attachment meant permanence? This is where power dynamics are often misunderstood. This isn't about control over her, it's about reclaiming authority over yourself. When a man remains emotionally regulated after separation, it subtly reframes the entire relationship in her memory. Suddenly, you're no longer the one who needed reassurance. You become the one who chose self-alignment over emotional bargaining. That shift is disorienting, because attraction is not built on who wants who more. It's built on emotional polarity. And polarity requires two grounded individuals, not one chasing and one retreating. Here's where many men sabotage this phase. They break no contact too early, not because they're ready, but because discomfort arises. Loneliness, doubt, the urge to clarify, the hope that one message might reset things. But when you interrupt the psychological process prematurely, you restore the old dynamic. You signal that your emotional center is still externally anchored, and the internal recalibration she was undergoing stops. Silence only has meaning when it's supported by internal change. During true no contact, her mind begins revisiting emotional moments with new perspective. And memory is not neutral. Memory is emotional reconstruction. She doesn't remember events as they happen. She remembers how they made her feel. And when there is space, feelings reorganize. This is often when admiration quietly replaces certainty. Not obsession, admiration. She begins to sense that you are not emotionally stalled, that your life did not pause waiting for her to decide. And that realization introduces a subtle fear not of losing you, but of misjudging you.
Women are drawn to men who can self-soothe, self-direct, and self-respect without withdrawing into coldness. And when those traits emerge after separation, they feel more visible than they ever were during constant contact. Because presence can be taken for granted. Absence cannot. This is why reaching out often doesn't happen immediately. There's an internal negotiation first. Curiosity battles pride, reflection battles fear. And underneath it all is a quiet question forming. Is he still the man I thought he was, or has he become more? And that question creates emotional pull, not because you disappeared, but because you stayed emotionally intact when the bond was removed. That is rare. And rarity creates value without a single word being spoken.
There's a moment that arrives quietly and most men never know it's happening. It doesn't come with a message or a sign. It happens internally, when emotional distance turns into emotional comparison. This is when she starts measuring her current emotional state against how she felt when you were part of her life. Not idealizing you, but noticing the difference. And difference is powerful, because the human mind doesn't chase what feels familiar. It chases what feels meaningful, in contrast. When you're no longer available to absorb her emotions, validate her uncertainty, or stabilize her mood, she is forced to regulate herself. And in that process, she realizes something subtle. You were a source of emotional grounding, not because you tried to be, but because you didn't collapse when things became uncertain, when you didn't argue for your worth, when you didn't demand clarity at the cost of self-respect. This is where longing can begin, but not the dramatic kind men expect. It's quieter, heavier. She starts wondering how you're doing, not out of politeness, but because your emotional presence left an imprint. And imprints don't fade with time alone. They fade when replaced by something equal or stronger. Often, nothing replaces it. This is why no contact isn't about waiting for her to miss you. Missing is passive, recognition is active, and recognition happens when absence reveals what presence once provided. But this phase only unfolds if you truly disengage from outcome. If you're secretly hoping, monitoring, or emotionally hovering, your energy hasn't shifted, and women sense that even at a distance. What draws her back is not nostalgia, it's alignment. She senses that you've returned to yourself, that your life is moving forward, that you are no longer orienting your emotions around her reactions. And that creates a paradox. When a man stops needing to be chosen, he becomes choosable again. Not because he's playing a role, but because he's no longer negotiating his value. This is when she may reach out casually, lightly, almost testing the emotional temperature, not to reclaim the past, but to see who you are now. And what determines everything is not what you say. It's what your presence communicates. Calm, stability, direction. That's what lingers. And that's what draws people back, not to what was, but to what has quietly become stronger in your absence. When she comes back, it's rarely with clarity. It's with curiosity. A message that feels casual. A question that seems small. But underneath it is a deeper search for emotional safety, for groundedness, for the man who didn't break when connection paused. What matters most here is not reunion, it's integrity. If you respond from wholeness, not hunger, the dynamic stays balanced. You don't rush to explain the past. You don't reopen wounds. You meet her where you are now, not where you were. And sometimes the most powerful outcome isn't getting her back. It's realizing you no longer need to, because no contact was never about her returning. It was about you returning to yourself. And when a man stands rooted in self-respect, emotional clarity, and direction, people don't come back because they're pulled. They come back because they recognize the strength they once underestimated,